welcome everyone to this exciting episode of Beyond the Crucible. It's a special episode of Beyond the Crucible for a couple of reasons, and we'll tell you what those reasons are as we move forward. Before we tell you why, the first thing I'll tell you of why it's special is this is our 100th episode. So, way to go, Warwick. We've arrived at 100 episodes of Beyond the Crucible.
Absolutely.
And the podcast, Beyond the Crucible, now in its 100th episode, is all about bouncing back from what we call crucible experiences. Those are things that happen in our lives, traumas, tragedies, setbacks, failures, things that we cause, things that are caused to happen to us. What they all have in common, regardless of their origin, is that they knock the wind out of our sails. They can change the trajectory of our lives. And the good news about that, about why we talk about it here, we don't talk about it here to spend 45 or 55 minutes kind of gathering around a virtual campfire so we can trade war stories and feel bad for ourselves. We talk about it here to offer hope and healing. That's a word that Warwick, who you just heard, who we'll talk more in a minute, is the founder of Crucible Leadership and the host of the show. And he talks about that a lot, that we're dealers in hope. And that's our focus here, is that through learning the lessons of our crucibles, and that starts by talking about our crucibles and talking about the things that we were taught through our crucibles. That then helps us move forward beyond our crucibles. So I will wait no longer to introduce Warwick Fairfax, who is the founder of Crucible Leadership, as I said, the host of the show, and my friend. Warwick, it's good to be here with you.
And it's great to be here with you, Gary. And we've got a special episode coming up.
We do. We have today's guest listener is someone you may have heard of. He is Gary Schneeberger. That's me. Now I get to read my own biography, which even for a public relations guy like me feels a little awkward, but I'm going to do it. Gary Schneeberger, me, is a former journalist and president of the public relations firm Roar, which I had to change my adjustments, but you can see it right here. If you're on YouTube, you can see my logo there. And is president of the public relations firm Roar, where he has advised Hollywood studios and international nonprofits. His first book, Bite the Dog, Build a PR Strategy to Make News That Matters, was an Amazon bestseller. His follow-up book, Frank Sinatra on the Big Screen, the singer as actor and filmmaker, has been done for a year, but has not yet come out. It's coming out this spring, the publisher tells us. It was written, just to be clear, co-written with my best friend, my co-author, film historian James L. Nyber. So you'll learn more about that as we go on and Beyond the Crucible. Perhaps I'll sprinkle that in, that my Frank Sinatra book is available. Not yet available, but it's coming soon in the spring. I live, he lives, I live. This is me talking as the guest. He lives, this is me talking as the co-host, in Camp Lake, Wisconsin, with my wife, Kelly, and their children, and their two children. And that is me in the shortest bio I've ever written in my life, Warwick. So I am steeled for your questions.
Well, Gary, thank you so much for coming here, because this is the 100th episode, is it?
100th episode.
Which is amazing. And we thought, what can we do that's special, that's different? And obviously,
right.
Listeners have heard a lot about my story, but they really haven't heard about Gary Schneeberger's story. Who is Gary?
Right.
He's the co-host. What's he about?
And why is he involved in something called Beyond the Crucible? Does he have crucibles?
And because Gary is human like the rest of us, surprise, he has crucibles. I don't know too many people that doesn't. Life is not easy. But Gary has some amazing challenges that he's come through the other side to indeed live a life of significance. So I think, in all honesty, we can learn from your story, from Gary's story, and it's a story of hope. And so that's why you're here. So as we always do, and you spent some time in Hollywood, we're going to get to the main event, but let's hear a bit of the origin story, the backstory of Gary Schneeberger. You obviously grew up Kenosha, Wisconsin. So tell us a bit about what life was like growing up in kind of the early years.
Yeah, and thank you for that, and thank you for the opportunity to be a guest in addition to being the co-host. It was a bit of a gimmick on our part when we said the 100th episode, let's do something completely out of the box. You interview me, so we thought that would be interesting, and we hope it is helpful as well. My origin story, my backstory, as you said, born in Kenosha, Wisconsin, youngest of five children. Um, there's some interesting age differences in my family. My oldest brother, Dean, he is 71, so he's 14 years older than me. And my closest sibling, my sister Jill, is 7 years older than me. So there's a wide range in ages. And when I came around after 7 years after my closest sibling, not only did she likes to point out, not only did I steal her babydom, right? She was not the baby of the family anymore, and she has still not gotten over that completely. I was sort of raised on my own in the sense that my brother Dean was long gone out of the house. He was in his late teens, early 20s by the time I was kind of ambulatory. And my middle siblings, there were three in the middle, 7 years, 8 years, 9 years apart from me. They all kind of hung out together and had their own pack. So I was kind of the raised separately from them. So their experience growing up, their childhood and my childhood differed a lot because we were raised in different environs, different circumstances. And the main circumstance that made that different was that my parents divorced. Our parents divorced, if I'm talking about my siblings. Our parents divorced when I was 9 or 10 years old. So they grew up with mom and dad. I grew up with mom and dad, but not in the same house under the same roof with the same last name.
So that's obviously pretty impactful. But I think, as you've mentioned to me, it's not like life was totally different. It's not like you never saw your dad or you wasn't around. You had a good relationship with both your parents, even though they were divorced.
Absolutely, and it's that's not to say that that wasn't a crucible. My parents divorced. It wasn't like when you're 9 or 10 and your parents get divorced, you think it's your fault. What did I do?
Mm-hmm.
Right? You're the last kid left in the house, the last child. They didn't get divorced through the four children they had before that. It was you. When you were little, you were a problem. So there was a little bit of that I struggled with, but it didn't last that long because I was I ahead of my years in maturity? I don't know. Did it just sort of the stars aligned and I was like, oh, I get that. I saw when my parents split up, as difficult as that was on me in some ways, not having them under the same roof, I saw that their lives individually improved. And as a child who loves his parents, you want to see them live the best lives that they can. So there was no, there were some not great things when they were together. There were fights and arguments and those kinds of things. Home didn't always feel like the safest place in the world. So when they divorced, I still saw my dad, as you said. I saw him every Sunday. More than that, he'd take me to ball games and take me to do things. So I lived with my mom. They didn't fight. They didn't argue over me. There was none of that stuff going on. And I began to see at a pretty early age that they were happier humans, not an endorsement at all of divorce, but they were happier people, no longer married to each other. And in fact, as I got older, as I grew into my teens and then into my 20s, I saw that the spouses that they met after they divorced were actually perfect fits for them, and they were both inordinately happier, which made me happy. But as a young kid, I did see that home wasn't as stressful. As much as losing dad from the home hurt, home life wasn't as day to day, moment by moment, as stressful as it was before that.
Hmm. There's another interesting kind of beat to the story as you were growing up. Your love of writing and journalism was
Yeah,
fostered at an early age, and I think there's something I believe your mom did for you that was a help on that path. She gave you a gift.
absolutely. Yeah, and it's when you're talking about uh, when you're talking to someone like me who's one of his earliest examples of a crucible is a parent's divorce, right? Is your parents' divorce. Having that the the tightening of that relationship with the spouse you live with my mom, was a huge help. I'm able to say the things I'm able to say about how the divorce impacted me early on because my mom did such a great job raising me as a single mom. I was in a neighborhood full of other single moms, and I had great friends who also helped in that process. But what you're alluding to is that my mom noted that I liked to write. That was like my favorite subject in grade school. I still have in the bookshelves behind me here, I still have the very first story I ever wrote in like first grade called The Pig. And it begins with, like once upon a time, except I spelled once ONEC. So it begins onic upon a time. But I learned to spell later. So my mom saw this in me. She saw this incipient desire to kind of put words into sentences, to arrange them into sentences, and to build stories. So she bought me when I was still 10, 11 years old, an electric typewriter. Listeners, if you're of a certain age and you have no idea what an electric typewriter is, look it up on Google, and you'll see. It's the precursor to a computer that you can do writing on, word processing on. She bought me an electric typewriter, which unlocked for me an entirely new world out of the out of the ashes, if you will, of her disappointment in her marriage failing. She was able to pour into me something that ignited my spirit. And I started writing. I can remember, Warwick, sitting in front of the television set, watching Monday Night Football and typing out the play-by-play, every incomplete pass. And by that, at that time in the 70s, the Packers stunk. So I was writing lots of interceptions and fumbles and stuff. But I was just typing so I could get the feel of what it was like to create words into sentences and paragraphs. But I eventually began to use that typewriter, and I still have them again in this bookcase behind me. I still have them to this day. Scripts. 70s were the height of super cop shows. So I wrote scripts where my buddies and I were super cops, and we saved the city from. I still remember the name of one of the villains, from Jojo Maroney, who was a bad guy mobster in our city, and we saved the city from that. And they're full of misspellings, and they're full of. One of the weird things that we did is that like we fought with monkey wrenches. I didn't even know what a monkey wrench was. I think I had it wrong. I saw it as like this big pipe wrench thing that you hit people with. But every episode I wrote, there was monkey wrench work going on to get us through. But what that did is create in me a place where, as I was going through things that felt like something was missing. My dad wasn't there all the time when I wanted a hug right there in the house. He, lived away a bit. I was able to sort of pour myself into those worlds I created, and I came to be able to craft stories, craft plots, do things like that. And that was a place where I escaped to, again, not run away from something that was truly horrendous. I've been on, the first 99 of these shows, 70 plus have involved guests who had far, far, far more, most of them had far more incendiary crucibles than I did. But it still was painful, and I was still able to go in there and kind of put a little cool water, put a little salve on that pain by writing. And that's where my love of writing took off, and I'm still doing it today.
And so, kind of from what I understand, that writing in elementary, middle, high school, that led you to want to pursue writing for a career. Now, initially, what you were thinking didn't end up quite the direction, but you went to college, and what was your major in college, and what were you thinking for a career?
I had a double major. I was an English major as well as a secondary education certification major. So I wanted to be an English teacher. I loved writing. I wanted to teach others to love writing. But as I kind of went through it, again, it's funny. I have, and get, and listeners, this, right? The level of maturity. Look behind me. I've got superheroes everywhere. I wear a hat all the time. I'm not exactly a button down type, and yet I learned some things. There was some maturity that came through me, and I knew when I was uh, in my early 20s, I would, if I became a bad teacher, if I got burned out like I had some teachers who were bad in high school in 10th grade, 11th grade, if that became me, this desire I had to teach others how to write, to equip them, to mentor them, to send them on their journey the way my mom sent me, that would suffer. I would not only not do that, I would stifle their growth. And I decided I couldn't do that. But one way to write and make money at it was to get into journalism, and that's what I did.
And so you began down a journalism career. Um, it seems like there were two paths in your life. One was you loved writing and you worked in a number of different papers and worked your way up. But at the same time, there was something else going on in your life. There was a challenge. I don't know quite how you want to unpack this, but there were like two tracks. You were doing well as a journalist, working your way up, but then there was this other track kind of going on that was a challenge. I don't know how you want to unpack that, but it was sort of, there's two tracks going side by side throughout 20s and 30s, if you will.
Yeah, from my teens,
Right.
and what you're referring to is I began, like many people do, to we had a bar in my basement, so I'd sneak down there and grab a little drink, and like, oh, okay, that tastes terrible, but I feel a little lightheaded or whatever afterwards, and it makes me feel older and cooler. And so from my mid-teens into my late teens, with my buddies, I began to drink, and I began to drink to excess quite often. While the journalism, and then as the journalism career went on, one of the vices that they tell you, there are three vices of journalism. And I know this because I served in journalism. One, cigarettes. Smoked those, don't anymore. Two, coffee. Never drank that, but I've got a Diet Mountain Dew inside this. And then three is alcohol. And that's one of the things that in journalism stereotypically can become a problem for people. And it became a problem for me. The more I moved on, the further I got away from home and the influences there that stabilized me, the more I tried to find um, joy, meaning, answers, fun, excitement, adventure in the bottom of a bottle, and never quite captured it.
So, but I think you've mentioned before you were a pretty functioning person. It wasn't obvious during the day that
Hmm.
Gary Schneeberger had a problem. I mean, so talk a bit about this was going on, but your career was, doing, pretty well. I mean, so talk a bit about that career in newspapers as you began working your way up in journalism. I know there's a subtext there, but talk about that journalism career.
Yeah, I was the typical itinerant journalist. I was the typical guy who every 2.5 years left for a different paper. So I started close to my hometown in Wisconsin. Then I moved to Iowa. But I never lasted more than 3 years because I got, restless. I wanted a better opportunity. I wanted better weather. From Iowa, I went to Palm Springs, California. I ended up in Victoria, Texas. At one juncture, I ended up in Wichita Falls, Texas. I ended up in Scottsbluff, Nebraska for a cup of coffee that lasted about 6 months. So I moved around to different places, not because I didn't succeed per se in most cases. Sometimes jobs got cut because newspapers had troubles then too, and I had to find another job. But as I was going to those places, the way that you connected, the way that you fit in as you moved into a new community and a new newspaper, you started to run with the pack in the newspaper. And I was one of those people that, in addition to growing in both the stature of my reporting nature, and then I became an editor. I was, one of the ringleaders, if you will, that pursued the extracurricular activities. So in the same way that while I was at home in my teens and early 20s, softball became the game lasted an hour and the drinking lasted five. Newspapers, we put out the paper, we put it to bed, and then we didn't go to bed for the next 4 or 5 hours when we went out. So that just started to ratchet up. But I was what I would call a highly functioning alcoholic. I was someone who could go to work all day, stay up all night, party with my friends, get up in an hour and a half or 2 hours and go right back to work again. And I actually had to let people go in my when I was a managing editor of a newspaper who were my good friends of mine who would go out with me at night and drink all night, who could not get themselves up and get into work, and they'd miss too much time, and I had to let them go. And it was like, look, I can do it, why can't you? So that was kind of the attitude that I had in terms of being highly functioning. My work was good, and my attendance was good. I wasn't falling, stumbling, falling down. Where things eroded, though, was morally. Things eroded for me ethically. Things eroded for me in ways that are true crucibles, that lead you to those things where after you've had the big party and you've gone out with your friends and you've had a great grand time, you lie in bed and you think, is this all there is? And that was where I was treating people poorly. It cost me a very early marriage. It cost me friendships. It cost me girlfriends. It cost me friends. The way that I behaved, even though I could do great at work, I was not a very nice human being many times. I wasn't honest. I wasn't to be counted on in certain things. Beyond work, I was a mess.
And, that's interesting because some of the guests might struggle with alcoholism, but some won't. And so they might have friends, family, but it's hard to understand something unless you've gone through it at a deep level. There's levels of
Absolutely.
understanding. And so I think what I hear you saying is it obviously caused, health challenges and various, just being able to function on all cylinders, that makes sense. But just this sense that not only did it cause that, but it caused more than that, in terms of, you talked about moral, ethical, character erosion. I don't know that your average person thinks of it quite like that alcoholism can do more than just cause you health challenges.
Right.
To me, that wasn't obvious to me. But that felt like it was true for you, that it caused far more than just health challenges. Maybe that even
Yeah.
wasn't the worst of it.
Oh, absolutely. And let's be clear, alcohol didn't cause my my character deficit. It it spotlighted it. I had a character deficit anyway. Alcohol just invigorated it and made it easier to do, made it easier to not have to face the consequences of your things and deal with it. One of the things I learned when I went into AA finally, and we'll get to that point, I'm sure. One of the things I learned then was what makes you an alcoholic is not how much you drink. It wasn't that it's not drinking an entire fifth of bourbon that makes you an alcoholic. What I was told in rehab was what makes you an alcoholic is why you drink. And I, looking at myself, realized I drank to change the way I felt. I felt like the kid that wasn't quite worthy of dad living in the home a little bit. Way in the back of my head, that was there. I felt like the kid who, I was overweight as a child, so I dealt with that. I felt like the guy that got rejected by girls when he dated them and they went out with somebody else. I changed I drank to change the way I felt. If I was happy, I wanted to get happier. If I was sad, I wanted to get happy. If I felt guilty, I wanted to feel free of that guilt. And those are the things that got alcoholism hooked in me and continued to go on until there was finally a rather explosive crucible that set me on the right path.
Yeah, and I want to get to that, but just for a brief second, because I think it's important for listeners to understand this, is that, we might have our own character defects, challenges. I think, we all have certain things in our life that, some bigger than others, but that aren't helpful. But it sounds like alcoholism, maybe like some other things, it's almost like putting kerosene on a fire. It just makes it worse. Or, fertilizer on weeds. It just makes the weeds well, I guess it depends on the fertilizer you use, but you know what I'm saying. It's sort of nutrients
Absolutely.
on weeds. It makes them grow stronger. So that's not to say that there aren't challenges, but what you don't want to do in life is add things to your life, and it could be alcoholism, it could be money, fast cars, the need for speed. I mean, you look at your, adrenaline junkie, you know, um, things that kind of magnify that of your choice. Um, so I want to get to that point, but let me just ask a question because listeners will probably be curious. And I think you really alluded to this in the last few minutes. Is you mentioned before with alcoholism, as with a lot of addictions, maybe all, there's always a why. So as you look back, because it's not like you didn't have an ideal home life, it didn't seem like it was, horrendous. As you look back, it's like you seem like a good kid. You love journalism. I think you've mentioned that. What were some of the strands of the why that you think that made you somebody that was, something that alcoholism could take advantage of you, if you will? Like, here we go. Gary's somebody that we can kind of, use. Depends, in different movies like Star Wars and others that talk about, the evil side and the good side and,
right.
spiritual warfare. And not everybody believes in all of that, but to the degree you believe there's a dark side and a good side, if you will, somehow there was something in your life that maybe some of these not so good forces sort of, we can use this stuff.
Yeah. And it was, not, for me, it was not quite feeling comfortable in my skin, not quite feeling good enough in my skin. And alcohol gave me thicker skin and gave me more attractive skin and gave me more friendly skin. And it helped me break down barriers that existed in various areas of my life. It was when I was in AA, it was very interesting. Somebody stood up one time because you would get up in an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting and you would say, "Hi, I'm Gary. I'm an alcoholic," and you talk about, what had happened in the week and why you drank and how it affected you and bad things that happened to you, what you lost, marriages and cars and houses and those things. But one of the guys got up, and the most honest thing I ever heard is the guy got up and said, "Look, let's be honest. There was a while there was a period of time where this worked for us, or we would not have done it for as long as we did it. It stopped working at some point. That's why we're here." And I think that's the truth. It worked for me. The problem was my focus was all on me. So while I was finding, okay, I'm confident, okay, this helps me feel like I belong, I'm mistreating people around me. And one of the ways that I was able to come to the realization finally that happened is that I sort of had a moments of explosion of things I could see were hurting other people, and that was like a wake up call. Things that hurt me, but also I could see how I hurt other people. It's sort of like I used to always use this example. It's like you're driving down the street and you hear a bump in your car on the highway, and you're like, Did I just hit like a squirrel or something?" But you don't actually get out of the car to check. You just kind of go, "Okay, maybe I didn't," and you keep going. Coming to terms with my alcoholism was getting out of the car, examining the tires, and seeing exactly what kind of quote unquote roadkill I was leaving behind in my life. And that was when the switch flipped.
So let's talk about the switch. There's a pivot point that you've mentioned to me in 1997, a journalistic conference in which it seemed to be, I don't know if you hit a wall or somehow you hit a point at which I can't ignore this. So talk about that day, which I know is a very challenging day, but I guess you could say some good came out of it, because out of that day came maybe one of the turning points in your life.
Absolutely. It was in 1997, in April of 1997, and I was working in Wichita Falls, Texas, and there was a journalism conference every year. The Associated Press has a journalism conference where they give away awards for the best journalism in the state, and it was in Corpus Christi, Texas, which is on the coast, which was kind of a fun place to go. And I was there representing my paper as the managing editor. My journalistic mentor, who taught me everything I really know about journalism, he was there as well. as the awards were handed out, my paper won a whole slew of awards. His didn't win any. It was like the mentee surpasses the mentor. It should have been a great moment of celebration. It wasn't. It was a great moment of degradation. Um, uh, in these conferences, they have hospitality suites where the journalists all gather and play games and play poker and drink. And it started out with me arrogantly bringing a bottle of my favorite top shelf whiskey. I didn't want their cheap whiskey. I brought my own. I'm shooting my mouth off. I'm flirting with the married woman who's at the card table with me. I'm just acting in such an obnoxious way that this is what happened. There was the managing editor of the Dallas Morning News, the largest paper in Texas. Every year at this conference, ran a poker game in the hospitality suite for 25 or 30 years. He would deal. I sat at the table to play that game. I was so obnoxious in the way I acted, from my arrogance about the whiskey I was drinking to the way I was treating people who were there, that Jack Welch was his name, the Emmy of the Dallas Morning News, got up, took his cards, and left the poker table. I drove away the founder of Texas journalism's. He was a dean of Texas journalism, and I drove away the founder of like the most fun thing about the Associated Press managing editors conference in Texas. I drove him away from the table. I knew when I got back to the office that was going to get back there. People still talk about this in the state of Texas 25 years after it happened. And I knew that was going to happen. That was going to come back, and that was probably going to be the end of my journalism career in Wichita Falls. So I went back to my hotel room, and this is the important part of the story that really pushed me over the line and helped me see I had a problem. And that was, many was the time when I was drinking and I was depressed. Remember, you talk about, I said,
Mm-hmm.
what makes you an alcoholic is why you drink. You try to get happy. It doesn't always work. The more you do it, the less it works. And it wasn't working for several years up until that point. And there were many times I would call friends. I would call friends in the middle of the night. We used to call it dialing while intoxicated, DWI. I would call friends up in the middle of the night and I'd say, oh, my life is terrible. I'm going to kill myself. I would say that. Now, one of the things, usually speaking, when you say that, it's a cry for help, is the general consensus. But I remember lying in my bed in the hotel in Corpus Christi, Texas that night, knowing I'd just blown up my journalism career, thinking that I wanted to end my life, but not calling anybody, just sitting, lying in my bed. And that scared me deeply because I didn't want to reach out for a lifeline, as it were. I was just sitting there. And somehow I got through that night, lots of tears. The next day I flew home. Somehow I knew it was going to be my last drink because I took one at the airport on the way home. This is the last drink I ever had. And got back to the newspaper, quit the paper that same day, and checked myself into rehab.
I mean, that's amazing. I mean, I do appreciate you sharing this, but because that's a very scary moment when it's one thing to say, okay, it's time for the lifeline. Let's, call some friends. But when you don't call friends, I don't know if it's like being in an airplane and in an old-fashioned plane and like, okay, you're used to hearing the sound, but the sound of the propellers have gone. There's no propellers, which means your likelihood is you're going to crash. And the nose is going down. So when you don't hear the propellers, you get really nervous. If you hear the propellers sputtering, you get somewhat nervous. When they stopped, it felt like it was almost that kind of moment, if you will, in which the silence, the no noise, the no voice, meant that a bad thing maybe was about to happen. So some people reach that point and just say, either do the ultimate, take their own life, or just say, look, I'm just going to keep going with this life and whatever, keep drinking. But you didn't. So Do you have any idea why? Because not every alcoholic makes the choice that you did. But why did you choose to check yourself into rehab and then AA? Why did you make that choice?
Clearly, I mean, the biggest reason is I did not want to die. So that was a big thing. And it's interesting, Warwick, I mean, we talk a lot on the show about, and it's a phrase that you first turned on the podcast here, where you say it could be your fault or not your fault. And so many of the guests that we've had on the show who've been through crucibles, it's not been their fault. It's been things that happened to them. This was my fault. I'm the one every time who chose to pick up the drink. I'm the one every time who chose to treat people roughly, verbally roughly, to lie to people, to cheat on girlfriends, to cheat on my wife at the time. That was all me. That was my fault. Something about that moment, I was tired. I was tired of living the life I was living, but there was just enough of still wanting to live a life of something. I didn't know what that was going to be, but I knew that it couldn't include alcohol, which is why, it was like I said goodbye to it. I had the one drink at the airport, like I said, and I went back and checked myself into rehab, and that was the last drink I had, April 27th of 1997.
So talk about AA, and it seems like AA was a springboard to a deeper spiritual journey. So just talk, because that really may be potentially the pivot point in your life. So talk about AA and that spiritual journey, and how the direction of your life from, we talk about the bottom of the pit, it felt like 1997 might have been close to the bottom of the pit for you. I mean,
yeah, for sure.
But then, because we're dealers in hope here, then hope sprang. Maybe it didn't come with a huge horn, but like a little ray of sunshine, little itty bitty ray that grew brighter and brighter. So talk about AA and that really path to a deeper spiritual awakening.
Yeah, it was. I backing up to my growing up years. We didn't go to church. We didn't have. I've been to church maybe 3 times in my life growing up, and that was to kind of go with girlfriends on holidays. So I didn't have any experience in that area. So um, in AA, or in treatment, they take you to AA meetings, and we all loved them because even before we knew what the content was, because it was the only time we could smoke. So we sat there and lit like one cigarette after the other, and smoked during the meetings, and that was, the smokiest things in the world are AA meetings, probably still to this day. Um, but I remember the concept that sort of clicked in my head was when AA talked about um, the idea of a higher power. And it was the first time truly in my life, growing up non-churched, not really understanding religion at all. It was the first time in my life when it occurred to me there was a power higher than me. I wasn't sure who that power was, what that power was, but the idea that I wasn't the ultimate highest power in my life um, kind of cracked open a window that let some breeze in, that let some sunshine in, and that began a process in which I did lean into the God of my own understanding, and that's another way that AA puts it. But there came a time, and that kept me sober for several months. But there came a time in my life where I had to asked the question. Logic for me didn't dismiss God as there's no way that could be. Logic for me told me if it's a God of my own understanding, and my own understanding is what got me lying in the bed, wanting to die and not wanting to call a friend to say I wanted to die. If that was what got me there, was my own understanding, how was a God of my own makeup going to help me? And that was when my I was open to the idea of something beyond that. That was when I started a new job in Palm Springs, California. I met a young woman in the newsroom. I wanted to date her. She didn't want to date me. She wanted to tell me about Jesus. She did. And over the course of several weeks, that led to me accepting Christ. And that was the 1-2 punch. AA got me on the on ramp, and then Christ got me to a place where true healing could then, from the inside out, occur.
So I think you've talked about this, but I just want to go, one step deeper. Uh, So AA talks about, you mentioned that a God of your own understanding, but yet it seemed like you had a deeper search for meaning and purpose, that it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't enough. So just talk about, in your case, why was your faith in Christ, I mean, why is that such a pivot point for you in terms of finding meaning and purpose beyond, at least, again, this is your journey, your truth, as we say,
Mm-hmm.
nothing against AA, but for you, there was something about your faith in Christ that just offered so much more.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said nothing against AA because I'm the biggest proponent still for AA. If it wasn't for AA, I don't think my life would have been saved. I think my faith in Christ has made my life worth saving, if that makes sense. There was
Mm-hmm.
the stain of my hand, the stain of the self destructive behavior. And then there was living in a way that made my life something that reflected goodness, not, self indulgence. But what was that for me? It was a longing for, right? I said earlier, I would come home after hanging out with the guys in the newsroom and lie in bed and go, there's got to be more than this. And when I was introduced to Jesus and I was introduced to people who followed him, and that was when I discovered that there was indeed something more than this. There was something more than just getting by day. There was something deeper to well before, long before, decades before, while you were still trying to bounce back from your crucible
Mm-hmm.
and find your life of
Mm-hmm.
significance. I began to understand without calling it that. What I wanted was a life of significance, and I didn't have it, and I wanted to find a way to get it.
And I want to shift to the next sort of point in your career, which is interesting. But one of the things we talk about a lot in Crucible Leadership and indeed on this podcast, Beyond the Crucible, is as you begin to claw your way back from the bottom of the pit, find meaning and purpose and a life significance, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others, um, one of the things that's absolutely critical is the word we call forgiveness. Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it's forgiving other people. Sometimes it's myself. For me, it was more forgiving my own stupidity. But I have to believe you would not be the person you are today without dealing with forgiveness, because I could potentially understand. I mean, you've said what I went through is my own fault. Uh, so how did you deal with the whole issue of forgiveness? I mean, we get what the Christian faith says is because Christ died on the cross for our sins, we are forgiven. Those are nice words. It's one thing to read it in the Bible. It's another thing to believe it. How do you deal with this whole thing of forgiveness, of frankly forgiving yourself?
It started for me anyway with forgiving others. One of the things AA is very good on is making amends, is what AA calls it. And
Mm-hmm.
that is, the people that you look through your life, seriously, they have you do
Mm-hmm.
homework. You go and you write down, here's the people you've hurt, here's how I've hurt them. And then you go to them and you ask them for forgiveness. And one of the things that blew me away was how many people just without hesitation, yep, I forgive you, hugged me. I mean, I didn't deserve it. And they gave it to me. And there's some kind of transference, I think, as you go through that experience, as you reach out to people. And there are still people, Warwick, there are still people to this day in the last year who encountered me during my alcoholic years. Who I've had the opportunity to apologize to for the way that I behaved in
Mm-hmm.
that time. And it's healing every time. But the more you go through that, the momentum you build, the flywheel turns, and you begin to find little ways to forgive yourself.
Hmm.
To go, okay, if this person who I treated this badly and I did this to can say, I forgive you, maybe I'm worth it myself. You say it on the podcast all the time. Aren't you worth forgiveness? Forgive yourself.
Hmm.
Aren't you worth that? And I had to come to a place where I felt worthy of forgiving myself. And the key to that, in a large part, was how many people who I had truly wronged. And again, we're not talking anything criminal or anything like
Sure,
that,
sure.
but who I had treated abruptly, I had treated poorly, I had lied to, cheated on. They almost to a man and woman, forgave me. And as those things build up, it becomes, to use another phrase of yours, a balm for your soul. And you're able to sort of go, okay, maybe I'm not a black hat. Maybe I don't have a black heart. Maybe there's something good inside here that someone could forgive me for that. I can forgive myself for that. And that was a real turning point for me.
So I want to pivot here, but I just want to make sure listeners understood what Gary said, because Gary said something really profound. And I really haven't thought about it this way before Gary said that. Is obviously when you do bad things, you think, God, how in the world can I forgive myself, which can be very difficult. But what Gary said is, for him, as he began to seek forgiveness from others, as he began to apologize to people that he encountered, people he felt led to seek out. And sometimes people will surprise you and actually say, I forgive you. The forgiveness of others was almost a catalyst in Gary being able to forgive himself. And so that is it's an interesting thought. So for those of you who feel like you may be not worth forgiving, just seeking to apologize to others, obviously it's the right thing to do, but it's not the reason you do it, but it actually can help you forgive yourself. I'd never thought about it quite that way, but I mean, that's just amazing that it worked that way. So I want to get to, you shifted after being in Palm Springs to work to a very famous, large, faith-based nonprofit. That was certainly a turning point in your professional life. So talk about those years at that organization.
Yeah, it's two stories will sum that up. So the organization's focus on the family, founded by Dr. James Dobson in the 1970s, very high-profile Christian leader. Two stories will sum up my experience there for the purposes of this and the purpose of, I'm still doing my co-host job here, and I'm watching the time, so I want to make this go as expeditiously as possible. But the first story is, so Focus has chapel service, still does. Every month there's a chapel service. And I got my job at Focus on the Family 6 months after I became a Christian. And I remember the end of the Christmas chapel service. Dr. Dobson prayed for all of the staff. And I walked out of that. We called it the chapelteria because it was also the cafeteria. They still do. The chapelteria. I walked out of the chapelteria crying because I realized that I'm getting paid for James Dobson to pray for me. That's a whole lot different than chasing news stories, and that's rewarding, but it's not with a capital R rewarding or underline rewarding or with any eternal significance rewarding. So that was when I realized, boy, my spirit was going to come alive in this place. So that was the sort of the first telling story there, and then the there was just something about being able to help people with their marriages, their parenting, with their walking out their faith in the public square. It's the same thing I think that you feel, Warwick, when guests say how they felt heard, when guests say, boy, that really helped me, when you hear from someone, from one of our listeners, that something has offered them hope. We were extending to people hope in difficult times, hope that marriages could be saved, hope that children who may be wayward weren't going to be that way forever. And hearing those stories every day, being involved, being able to be in the midst and help with those stories. Yes, it was rewarding to break news as a reporter, but at the end of the day, not all the time did anything really change or for eternal significance. These are things, when I was involved, that these are things that focus on the family, gave me a sense of fulfillment that went beyond just job well done. It went to the things we talk about focusing on legacy and significance and those kinds of things.
So do you think there's a link? I mean, you come to Christ and you shift from journalism, which you've been, 15 odd years, to focus on the family. Do you think there was like a link between the two, that Because that's quite a career shift. You've been a writer your whole life, and you go from journalism to focus. Do you think there was like a link at all, or I mean, how'd that happen
Yeah.
basically?
I mean, I think there was. I started at Focus as a writer for one of their magazines. I
Mm.
quickly moved into the public relations communications space, to the point that I eventually worked my way up over the course of a couple of years to being Dr. Dobson's personal public relations guy, which was really funny. Here's a funny story. Sorry, I know I'm keeping time, but I'm going to take 2 minutes to tell the story because it's funny, and it's telling. It's telling about how people knew me in my time growing up in my late teens and early 20s. I was I was profiled. I was living in Colorado Springs, where Focus on the Family is located, and I was profiled by my hometown paper here in Kenosha, Wisconsin, on their religion page. And there's a picture of me on the religion page, and it's because I'm Dr. Dobson's right hand man for communications and public relations. A friend of mine who knew me in my early 20s, who ran with me in my early 20s, called me up and said this to me: I saw your picture on the cover of the religion section of the Kenosha News, and I said to myself, Schneeberger finally burned down a church.
Oh my gosh.
So, in other words, not that I was ever angry or had
Sure.
anything against churches. He just saw me as a guy who had no moral moorings. So when he saw me on the religion page, he thought I must have done something truly terrible. And is that shows the change in my life. Again, those little things where you help people with something that's eternal, as we talk about here, as you
Yeah.
begin to walk around the space and you feel yourself in that life of significance where you're living in, a life on purpose in service to others, that then builds up a different kind of confidence. So, what my friend was reacting to was the kind of superficial confidence that I demonstrated when I was younger. What he encountered when he saw me, he reached out to me with something completely different. And it was a very sweet moment. And we're still friends to this day. He still lives here. I'm back home again, as you said now. And well, he actually came to my wedding back in 2017. So,
So I think what that shows is there were signs to others that Gary Schneeberger is becoming a different person. He's
yeah,
not the
I
Gary
was,
Schneeberger, maybe we knew back in the day in the neighborhood as teenagers. He was
no,
becoming a
and
different person.
what somebody once described me as, who knew me after I was a Christian. I worked at Focus, but they were sort of recalling some of the stories they heard about me in my days, like my friend Tom did when he called me up and said, "You burned down a church." The phrase that was used to describe what I was smarmy reprobate. That's what they described me as
Oh boy.
prior to my sobriety and my salvation. So again, a smarmy reprobate is not a danger to society, really. He's just
Right.
someone that you want to kind of maybe move to the other side of the room when he's there because he talks too much about himself, or he just doesn't care about you. That was the vibe I gave off. That's what my friend Tom was reacting to, and that's what my time at Focused helped pull out of me.
So let's move on here to, I know you had a stint in Hollywood from like 2012 to 2016. So tell us a little bit about that and how that happened, because you moved from journalism to Focus, and now you go to Hollywood. So that's another shift. So talk about that shift.
Yeah, I'm a career chameleon. Um, but the I was 12 years at Focus on the Family, and I was there when Dr. Dobson left and the new president Jim Daly came in. And my job as the vice president of communications was to navigate in the press the transition from the founder, Dr. Dobson, to Jim Daly, the next generation leader. Had to put Jim on the map, had to get him in the press, had to make a name for himself, had to do a bunch of things to make that happen. That over the course of time did happen over the course of 3 years. Jim was established. He just released a book. My last day at Focus on the Family was when Jim's book called Refocus, which was his manifesto on how Christians should engage the public sphere, the public square. The day that book came out was the day that I left Focus, because I felt like my calling there, my job there was done. I had turned around the Titanic, the big ocean liner that is hard to turn around, to go from founder, enormously popular, famous founder, to a lesser known but enormously talented second generation president. I raised the profile of that second generation president. He became, one of CNN's top Christians to watch. Other magazines did the same sort of thing. He got identified and recognized. We did well there. So I decided, okay, I've always liked movies. Remember, I wrote scripts when I was 10 for my buddies and I to act out. So I took a job with a marketing firm in Hollywood, which faith-based marketing firm, which marketed films, both faith-based films and secular films with faith-based content. What that or that would appeal to faith-based press. The example I use all the time, people would ask me, we worked on the Superman reboot, Man of Steel. People ask me, well, why are you're a faith-based marketing firm. Why are you working on Man of Steel? And I said, well, it's the story of an otherworldly father who sent his only son to earth to save mankind. I read that in a book somewhere, right? I mean, that's a Jesus story in some sense, right?
Indeed. Absolutely.
So I went there and did that job over the course of 3 years, and learned much, and accomplished much, and continued to feed this idea that it was more than box office receipts that we cared about. It was more than that. It was people picking up their Bibles and reading them after a certain show came out. That was the rewarding part. That was the legacy part for me.
You mentioned there's an interesting story that you've told me about the movie Noah, and I know sometimes it gets a bit of flack because, it's the Bible isn't always full of all the details of the story. It just puts
right.
what God thinks is necessary for us to know. But so it got a bit of flack, but yet it definitely had a spiritual impact. I think it's just a fun story when you talk about the impact of movies spiritually that people might not know.
Right. I mean, Noah starred Russell Crowe. The biblical story of Noah, he doesn't speak until the ark lands on dry land. You've got Russell Crowe as your star. If you're going to do an absolutely biblically accurate account, Russell Crowe is in his first silent movie. He doesn't talk until the last third of the movie. So we can't do that. So there were some additions taken, as I would argue they were extra biblical, not in the Bible, but not contra biblical. But the good news, despite all of the rancor that came from some in the faith community, is that when that movie came out in 2014, and I'm reading this out of my book right now, the website BibleGateway.com, the weekend that Noah premiered, reported a 223% increase from the previous weekend in the number of people who looked up the Noah story in Genesis chapters 6 through 9. Also, YouVersion, which is a Bible app, the number one Bible app for smartphones in the world, saw a 300% increase in users opening the biblical account of Noah in the US, and a 245% increase globally. My argument then, my argument now is, how does a movie that drives people to read the Bible, how is that a bad thing? This was at a time, remember, that every movie was about a Harry Potter book or a comic book. This was the good book getting read by people because of a movie. That was a good day at the movie PR factory for me.
Absolutely. So I want to talk about maybe one of, if not the most recent crucible that you went through, in which
yes.
there was, we were talking recently about blessings coming out of crucibles. Perhaps this is a good example. So talk about, you had a crucible in Hollywood, but it did lead to the blessing in what you're doing currently. So talk about that last shift.
Yeah, I mean, Hollywood is an interesting place to work. And interesting is a good PR word, because when I say it's an interesting place to work, you don't know what I mean by that. Do I mean it's a good place to work? Do I mean it's not a good place to work? It's just interesting. But it is an interesting place to work, and there are good and bad aspects to it. But before I tell the story about Hollywood, I'll compare it to sports. And the example that comes to my mind right now, if listeners, if you're a baseball fan, look up, or if you're not, look up the name Gabe Kapler. Gabe Kapler is the manager of the San Francisco Giants, and Gabe Kapler is the reigning National League Manager of the Year, voted number one manager in the National League. The previous year, he was manager of the Philadelphia Phillies, who fired him. Is Gabe Kapler a good manager or a bad manager? He was just a manager that one team it worked, one team it didn't. I was head of publicity for a PR firm that represented and promoted several movies. Three or When you're like that in Hollywood, Hollywood operates like pro sports. When you're in charge of something and you have three or four movies that don't do well, the box office is disappointing. The studio's not going to shut down. The owner of the company probably isn't going to run away. But somebody who's at the highest level of leadership in the publicity side of things, it just so happened I was let go because what the founder of what the owners of the company had to do was be able to tell studios going forward, okay, this guy's no longer here who was running our publicity department. We've got new blood in place, and that helps you then get more contracts and get more things going on. So no one ever said I was terrible at what I did. It was just the movies weren't any good, or they were good movies. The movies didn't do well at the box office. The numbers were disappointing. So they decided, let's get some new people in here, just like like Gabe Kapler got another job after he got fired. That's kind of what happened. And I was at a crossroads. I was at a place in my life where, um, oh my gosh, I'm 51 years old. Um, I've got to find a job. What do I do? And that was when it struck me that I was gonna start my own business. I was going to start my own firm, and that's uh, Roar. I'll hold up for people who are on YouTube. You can see there it is. There's my card. I started my own firm in 2016 after this occurred, and I never would have had the guts to do it with a cushy Hollywood job where they give you a Lexus leased car and you get all this. That never would have happened for me. I never would have been able to leave that. But when that was removed from the table for me, it gave me the opportunity to say, you know what? I've learned a lot over the course of these years I've been doing this. Let me put that to use, not just in Hollywood, although I still do work for promotion of Hollywood films, but also for a variety of clients across the way, including you, Warwick, and Crucible Leadership.
So that's sort of fascinating that sort of brings you to sort of the current chapter you're on with Raw. That sometimes, I don't know, with me as listeners would know, I never would have been able to leave Fairfax Media if the company hadn't gone under in late 1990. I could never have left. And similar but different. It sounds like you, Gary. How can you leave Hollywood? You're helping to promote faith-based and secular film to a faith-based audience. Seems like a pretty good calling.
Yeah.
It was kind of fun. It was cool. Nothing wrong with having fun. And you're making a difference. But yet, if you believe in a sovereign God, for whatever reason, he had another plan. And this plan wasn't just professional. It was personal. So talk about, because that really brings you to where you are now, which I think
Right.
I would hazard a guess to say you feel pretty blessed, I would say these days,
Indeed.
if that's an accurate word. So talk about how it
Indeed.
it was a professional and personal shift for you leaving Hollywood.
One of the crucible moments in life at Focus on the Family, marriage, parenting, helping people walk out their faith. I had my wife at the time, who was, by the way, I mentioned there was a young woman in the newsroom in Palm Springs who talked to me about Jesus. I ended up marrying that young woman, and so we're in Hollywood, and it was over time became a rocky marriage. It became a difficult marriage. So I was dealing with that. I was dealing with not having a job, and I got to a point where the marriage was not salvageable. those of I'll say only this to those of you who are Christians who are listening in. There were biblical grounds on my part to end the marriage, and I did. Uh, at the same time, as that was going on, um, I've had this weird habit my entire life. You've indicated, Warwick. There are a lot of stops on my journalism career track. I've worked a lot of places. Um, I like social media. And so periodically over the years, and many times it's been done to offer an amends, as AA would say, or to apologize to people who I haven't seen, who I used to work with. So I would be sitting around if I was bored and go, hey, I wonder whatever happened to Joe Smith, who worked at this newspaper that I worked at in Victoria, Texas. And I try to find Joe Smith on Facebook, and I'd say, Joe, what's going on? We became Facebook friends. Sometimes I was able to, run into women I knew that I dated in those situations and say, hey, sorry about that. It was great. It was just it's kind of this fun thing that I've done over the years. And on February 13th, 2016, 2 days after my birthday, my mind just floated back to this reporter I knew in college who was a young, at the time, a young girl. She was 17, and I was editor of my college newspaper here in Wisconsin, in Kenosha, and I recruited her out of high school to come work for me. And she was so good that I promoted her to be an editor. And I didn't know much about journalism at the time. I'm 21, but I'm trying to mentor her. I found her on Facebook, sent her a message. Could it be the one-time ace journalist at the University of Wisconsin Parkside, Kelly McKissick? If so, wow. What's going on? How you doing? Within like 12 minutes, she responded back and said, it is me, Gary. Wow. And she had been married and she was in the middle of a divorce. And over the course of the next several months, not even months, let's be 100% accurate journalistic. In the course of the next several weeks, we discovered through messaging back and forth the way that we first learned who each other was. And we never dated in college. I was her mentor. We were friends. So much so that when she graduated, I gave her my pen because I wanted to encourage her to continue writing. We discovered that we were still friends. We discovered that we still had a lot in common. And more than that, we discovered that we were in love. So that was February 2016. By spring of 2016, a couple months later, I moved back home from Hollywood to my hometown in Wisconsin, where I kind of courted her, and we got married in 2017. So that story's come full circle.
And you now have a wife and a family and kids.
Right. The thing that, cool too. Yeah, being a focus on the family, not having any children, it was like, what do I have to offer now that the transition is over? And here's the funny part. All those 12 years I was a focus on the family and listened to all the broadcasts about raising kids, that stuff sticks to you. You learn that stuff. So I have two beautiful stepchildren, my wife, Kelly, her two children, my stepchildren, Alyssa and Hunter. And I've learned all that stuff I learned there has come in handy here. And I've discovered that my desire to have kids is everything, now that I have them, is everything that I wanted and stuff I didn't realize I could want. And that's been an inordinate blessing for me.
Wow. So obviously, I'm sure you feel truly blessed. So as we kind of bring things to a close here.
Yeah, the captain's got to turn on the fasten seatbelt sign. I think
I
heard it.
And I think maybe the managing editor is about to, put the paper to bed. And
that's right.
I think I can hear the press is almost about to start to roll as big turbines, so to speak, are about to churn. So
good job.
For those of you who've never been in where they print newspapers, it's pretty cool. Late at night, 2 a.m. in the morning, whenever it is, when the presses roll. But as you look back at your life, at the challenges and the blessings, what are some lessons? I mean, you've had some really tough experiences, challenging experiences, gut-wrenching crucibles. It's not. Few people have had easy lives. You certainly have not had an easy life. But what do you feel like the lessons? I know you're a person of faith, so maybe you think of it, God has taught you. I'm not quite sure how you put it, but what are some key lessons as you look back at your challenges and some of the blessings that you feel like you've learned?
First thing would be in 2005, Peter Jackson, who's in the news now because he made a documentary about the Beatles from the footage from the movie Let It Be. But Peter Jackson, before he got into the Lord of the Rings movies, did a remake of King Kong in 2005. And I really liked the movie, but there's almost a throwaway line in there. Jack Black, the actor, plays this kind of shyster film director who's trying to fast talk his way to get to Skull Island to get Kong, and he keeps running into things that don't go right, don't go right, don't go right. Talk about crucibles. He hits them every time he turns around. But he says to his assistant at one point, and this line always stuck with me. It's not a big line in the movie, but he said this: defeat is always momentary. So I think that my life is a lesson about that. I bumped into a lot of brick walls. A lot of them I ran into myself head first with a running start, but it's always momentary. That's one of the things we talk about on Beyond the Crucible all the time. It doesn't have to be your worst day. Your worst day doesn't have to define you. So defeat, as Carl Denham, the character played by Jack Black, said in King Kong in 2005, defeat is always momentary. That's number one. Second thing I would say is, and it was funny. We were on a call the other day, Warwick, and I said this to someone about, you don't have to tell us the stuff that we do right. Just tell us what we need, what we can do better. And you were like, well, I kind of like hearing what I can do right. I'm sort of it helps me. And I was like, ooh, I felt bad. But from my perspective, you learn more about what's vital in life and the life you want to live from what you struggle with than where you excel.
Mm-hmm.
Chances are, in fact, you already know what you do well.
Mm-hmm.
So pay more attention to those things you can do better, because the attitude that you can do better is the very reason why you will do better. Um, yes, it's good to hear you did this right. Absorb those moments, but really dig in. When we talk about learning the lessons of your crucibles, dig into those things where you stumble, dig into those things where you've hit that wall, and learn the lessons of that. Because as you get feedback from that, we talk about it all the time on the show. When you get feedback from people about what you can do better, that's fuel to actually do better. And if your heart, mind, spirit is open to the fact that you don't have it all together, that helps you get it all together because you have the right attitude going forward. And the third thing is the biggest thing I learned when I was in Hollywood. All movies come in three acts. There's the first act, second act, third act. The third act is always the most exciting, right? That's when the big crisis happens. The couple who's been together for acts one and two has a conflict. They break up. Something bad happens. The cop loses the bad guy. That looks like the bad guy's going to win the day. Something's gone wrong. That happens in act two, and then the action ramps up. The hero rises to the occasion. And then in the last act comes the conclusion. That third act, the conclusion comes. Cowboy rides off into the sunset. In Die Hard, John McClane gets in the limo and drives away. I mean, it's where all the action happens and all the happy endings happen, and all of the legacy, goodness, satisfaction, all of those things, significance, all of those things occur. When I was in Hollywood and lost my job as the senior vice president of publicity for that firm, I was 51 years old. I was just at the start, if you believe actuarial tables, I was just at the start of Act Three of my life. Um, and I'm since then I've moved back home to Wisconsin from Los Angeles. I've married a woman who is so kind and sweet and supportive. I have two wonderful stepchildren. All of those things happened at just the start of the third act of my life. So that's my story of the third act of my life. Always remember, listeners, that life comes in acts, and each act kind of wraps up. So no matter where you are, if it's first act, second act, or third act, there are always plot twists. There are always opportunities to move forward and end in a place that is better than the place that you started. One of the things, even if you're in the last act of the third act of your life and it seems like it's ending on a bad note, I think of, speaking of Peter Jackson, I think of the third Lord of the Rings movie. That movie had like five false endings. Just when you thought it was over and you were gathering your popcorn, there was another ending.
Right.
Um, the ending doesn't have to be the ending. I'll go back to Die Hard, which we have a blog, which is on we have a blog about Die Hard and the crucible lessons you can learn that's on crucibleleadership.com. When we think that movie's over, John McClane's dropped the terrorist out of the top of Nakatomi Plaza. Oops, another bad guy shows up, throws off a coat, and is going to shoot him. And John McClane's cop buddy, um, Al Powell, saves him by taking out the bad guy. There can still be false endings. So even if you think it's ended on a note that hasn't been great, keep going one step forward. One small step at a time, as Warwick says, because that could be a false ending. You can write your own ending. Great thing about that, all movies have three acts. You're the screenwriter of your story.
Wow. Well, that is a great place to end. I think I can indeed hear the managing editor or production
Yep,
manager, as the case may be, has hit the button and the
it's
cylinders are
shaking.
rolling and
It's
the
shaking. The
papers
presses are rolling.
and so just as we close, and then you can close us out as you always do. I just want to say, just personally, you've been such a blessing to me, to Crucible Leadership.
Mm.
We brought you on board originally because we felt like it was time for public relations, but you do that great. But you do so much more than that. You've as we were in the third act of getting this book published. You sort of were my wingman as we went through the last edits to make sure it was true to the story and the message, and you get Crucible Leadership at a deep level, the co-host to Beyond the Crucible. We're different personalities, actually very different, common faith, but different people, certainly different upbringing, that's for sure. But yet sometimes people, different traits, different backgrounds can make for really a great complementary team, which I think we are. And we wouldn't be where we are today without you. So you've been certainly a great blessing to me personally and to Crucible Leadership. And so thank you for helping make Crucible Leadership what it is today. And it's been a blessing to hear your story. There's so much in it that I think listeners can really find hope as you've charted through your challenges to live what is an amazing life of significance. You've kept moving forward, and you are blessed and have been blessed. And look at what you do now with Roar and a wonderful family. And those are times when you wake up and you think, "Thank you, Lord. I'm just blessed." Is that like a fair summary?
Yeah, I mean,
if you feel you are.
I don't think about it all the time, and that's why this is a great opportunity to talk about those things, because I don't think about the moment in the hotel in Corpus Christi lying in the bed not wanting to go on. I don't think about that every day. I don't think about that hardly ever. So to go, I was there 25, 26 years ago, and now I'm here. Those two people aren't the same people. They don't have any of the same values. They don't have any of the same emotions. They have none of those things. So yeah, it's an absolutely fair summary, and it's all been because taking one small step and learning to move on, and learning to say I'm sorry, and learning to say I forgive you, and learning to yourself and to others, and learning to do those kinds of things. We say it all the time. I'm going to say it here in a minute. It doesn't have to be the end of your story. And all of those things that happened, all the things that happened to you, listener, that are crucibles, could be the end of your story, but you have to let it be. And I surprise myself sometimes when I say all life's in three acts, all movies are in three acts, your story's in three acts. You're the screenwriter. You can write the way every act goes, no matter what act you're in. You get to write your own ending. And that is a beautiful thing. So until the next time we are together, listener, now I've put on my co host hat. I'm no longer the guest. Thank you for spending time with us here at Beyond the Crucible. And do remember, as I just said, that those crucible moments in your life are not the end of your story. I talked about all kinds of things that could have been the end of my story. And I write stories. So I know they could have been the end of my story. Um, but they weren't. And the, the, so you don't have to be at a place where those things become the end of your story either. In fact, if you learn the lessons of your crucibles as you move forward, those moments can be the start of the best chapter of your story, the best act of your story, because where they lead is where they've led for me, and that is to a life of significance.